From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones.
Morning, everybody. Here's a little video of me. It's rude to put hats on a table.
Sorry.
Is this your hat?
Yeah.
Children.
This is the final thing Liam Payne posted online. A video from his holiday in Buenos Aires.
A lovely day here. This is the breakfast table.
I'm just eating an orange.
Just enjoying coffee and breakfast, even though it's like 1 p.m.
He'd grown up in one of the world's biggest boy bands, One Direction, and was now a solo artist, still finding his feet.
Today, we ride. We're going to ride some horses.
On Wednesday night, the news broke that Liam, who was 31, had died.
So I heard on Thursday morning, about 7:30, normal time, waking up, and I saw various missed messages from the Times saying that I needed to that Liam had died. Came as a total shock.
He'd fallen from the balcony of his hotel window.
It's bizarre, and it was very, very sad. Just before, he'd been at Niall Horan's concert, his former One Direction bandmate, in Buenos Aires. He'd been spotted dancing in the audience and sort of getting attention from fans, even though it wasn't his concert. So it all seemed quite odd. And then the way in which he died, I mean, you know, the news was filtering through, and the first thing I thought was just absolutely tragic. I mean, you know, falling from a balcony, you know, it's horrible, but it's the thought that this guy's only 31, and, you know, like so many pop stars, who knows what sort of state he was in, but he was in the situation of having been in such a successful band when he was really young, and then you kind of get the impression, well, what do I do now?
The story today, the death of One Direction star Liam Payne.
My name is Will Hodgkinson. I am the chief rock and pop critic of The Times.
Good evening. We'll begin with the breaking news tonight that Liam Payne, the star of One Direction, has died after falling from a balcony in Argentina, according to local reports. The singer is believed to have fallen from the third floor of a hotel.
Quite quickly after all of this, the recording of the 911 call came out. Someone in the hotel lobby, the manager, called 911.
Hola, buenas tardes. Mira, te estoy llamando del Hotel Casa Sur Palermo que queda en Costa Rica.
They said, we've got a guest who has had too many drugs and alcohol, and when he is conscious, he's trashing the entire room, and we need you to send someone to help. They said, we need you to send someone urgently, because I don't know whether his life may be in danger, the guest's life. He's in a room with a balcony as well. We are afraid. In terms of 2024, who was Liam Payne? I mean, what was his role culturally?
Well, that was the problem. Liam Payne was, everyone knows, as the guy who was in One Direction.
Thought I saw a girl brought to life. She was warm, she came around, she was dignified.
You know, Liam Payne had done an album, but it came out in, I think, 2019. That's 3 years after One Direction had split up. And he was going to be the guy that was the big star of One Direction. He was a very good singer. He'd been on The X Factor when he was 14, incredibly young. 2 years later, One Direction were put together by Simon Cowell as all of these people who didn't make it. You know, they weren't the winners.
That's the thing you forget, isn't it? That they all auditioned separately.
Yeah, of course.
And there have been some lovely clips of him singing a Sinatra song, Liam Payne, in one of his early auditions. But then, as you say, they didn't get through as soloist, so they were just, One Direction was formed by the X Factor.
They were put together in front of the nation. And this is the thing. I mean, it was very hard to pretend that they were a bunch of, you know, good friends on the road together when we'd seen that they're a bunch of strangers, teenagers, children, really. I mean, 16 is so incredibly young. So, I mean, I think the way to understand this, everything that happened since, was that Liam Payne was meant to be the guy. He was the good-looking one. Well, they're all good-looking, but he had that kind of slightly more kind of rugged bad boy looks. He's a working-class kid from, I think, Wolverhampton. His father had been very instrumental in encouraging him to pursue this kind of career. And, I think in his mind, the band had been built up around him. And when it came to an end, as all boy bands always do, obviously, their fans grow up and they grow up.
Why do you think One Direction worked so well? Because we've had boy bands in the past, but they were stratospherically successful.
I think they worked so well because they stripped it all away. So first of all, we'd seen it all happen on television, and this is when the X Factor is at the height of its success. So everyone gets to know them, and rather than the model that had come before, I mean, if you go back to the Bay City Rollers and bands like that, it's kind of matching tartans. But then by the 90s, which is really the kind of glory days of the boy band, it was all sort of, nice matching suits and high stalls and singing in harmony. And it was kind of for mums more than kids, really.
Standing up from the stalls on the key change.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff. It's very cheesy, let's face it. You had Take That, but even Take That was sort of very much, sort of wearing these good matching outfits and everything. So One Direction come along. They're a bunch of kids. They've all got that kind of scruffy tousled hair, which is very, fashionable at the time. They didn't wear matching outfits. They didn't do dance routines. I went to see them at the O2 and they literally just kind of shuffled about on stage, not looking like they knew what to do with themselves. But all of that was the appeal because they were boys next door. They were charismatic. There was sort of one for every teenage girl could fancy one in a very safe way.
Because they were the same age as them.
They're the same age as them, and also boy bands serve a very important function in the sense that they provide an early crush. You're not going to meet them. They're not going to break your heart. You can fantasize about marrying them, whatever's going to happen. But it's all safe. It's a way of dealing with emerging teenage emotions.
Yes.
And that's really what the role One Direction was there for.
And was that all on display in the O2 that night when you were there? I mean, was it just packed full of, girls of a certain age losing their minds?
Well, girls of a certainly young age. For me, I remember it was absolutely horrible because I was there to review it, and it was just the screaming was so intense that you couldn't really hear what was going on, and what was going on stage wasn't very much anyway. And that wasn't the point. The point was that these girls were there, and these boys were in their midst, and that was enough. And this is when Zayn Malik was in the band, who was the first person to leave. So it was a phenomenon. It was something to witness, and you realised that it wasn't going to last.
And in terms of how we would rank that in terms of other examples from history, I mean, are we talking sort of Beatles level of absolutely being mobbed with hordes and hordes of screaming girls?
No, we're not. And it's a different thing because the Beatles were so culturally hugely significant and, wrote their own songs and everything changed. Within 10 years, they went through, the history of the 60s, so to speak. One Direction weren't like that, but they did have a certain appeal. I mean, there's an album called Midnight Memories, and it was about them sort of pretending to be a hard-working rock and roll band on the road. It's all, we roll into town, we're all tired, all these stories. I mean, in a way that was true, but the whole thing was obviously put together for them, and they were, placed in these situations. But you could see the appeal because it was like a kind of a starter. There was almost like an indie pop band or an indie rock band that wasn't an indie rock band. They're sort of set up that way. The way they dressed, the songs, that they did a cover of Should I Stay or Should I Go by The Clash. And there was a certain, and especially with Liam Payne, you definitely sense that he was probably the kind of guy, I think he liked bands like Linkin Park, new metal bands. He wasn't really a stage school kid.
Yes.
And that was part of the appeal as well, that they weren't totally groomed, even if they were. The image was that they were just a bunch of kids. They come together, they're great mates, and now we're all going to have a good time together.
And putting out some really good songs, actually. I mean,
it's
my vintage, so
well, there you go.
It was
it's slightly lost on me, but you're younger than me.
The band obviously then. Well, I think they said they went on hiatus, didn't it? Zayn went, the others remained, but they decided to go on hiatus, and they all pursued their various solo careers. What was Liam's like, bearing in mind, as you said earlier on, he was sort of picked out, at least he said in the past, as being the most promising of the bunch?
Liam should have been the Robbie Williams of the group. And 10 years previously, he would have been the Robbie Williams of the group because culture changes. He would have been the guy who is like a bit laddish, a bit troubled, kind of the bit like the guy singing in the pub, but also got something extra. There's something, working class kid. So it would have been him, but culture changed. And by 2016, there's a whole new mood of gender fluidity and a kind of feminization of pop music.
Camp pop is back.
Camp, it's kind of camp. I'd say feminine more than camp. Camp suggests an irony. It wasn't necessarily ironic. I think it was more feminine. And Harry Styles was perfect because he's very pretty, very stylish. He's willing to take all the risks, and he just worked perfectly. And so he was the one, and it wasn't expected. He was the one that sort of stole the limelight. And the thing is with boy bands, almost always there's only one that can have that huge breakthrough career, and it was Harry, not Liam. And I do believe that Liam had been told that it was going to be him. I mean, it seemed like everything was going towards that, and he was a good singer.
And in your piece for the Times, you also suggest that actually what he was putting out as a solo artist also didn't quite marry up with what he should have been doing. If he was let loose as just a true expression of himself.
Well, I think so. I mean, it came out 3 years after One Direction split. I mean, 3 years is a lifetime in for teenagers. So all of the momentum from One Direction had gone. He was kind of reinventing himself as a sort of grown-up, sexy R&B guy, but it didn't seem like him. It didn't seem to be right. There wasn't anything particularly striking about it. This album's called LP1. It was all right, but nothing to mark it out. Whereas Harry Styles had come along and made this album, which is completely different, and it was drawing on 80s pop and new wave, and it's kind of cool. So it was a misstep, and you do feel, well, how could he have known? When you've been famous, or at least on television since the age of 14, you're going to be relying on the advice of adults who you assume have got your best interests at heart.
Yeah. It was only one album he put out, wasn't it? Was there was talk soon that there might have been a second, is that right?
Yeah, and the sadness for me is that this guy could have really found himself. You don't know. He's 31, that's nothing.
Well, we've been talking about Liam Payne. Sadly confirmed this week that he died at the age of 31 in Buenos Aires in Argentina. There have been so many tributes coming out. I mean, every hour, the day it happened, people like Ronnie Wood. We've seen Harry Styles' mum posted a comment about him. His family have put out a statement saying they're heartbroken, that he'll forever live in our hearts and we'll remember him for his kind, funny and brave soul. There's also a really striking one from Rebecca Ferguson. She was on X Factor with him. She said, "We both met at Euston Station and shared a taxi together to the X Factor, young, innocent and unaffected by fame. I can't help but think of that boy who was hopeful and looking forward to his bright future ahead." She said, "If he hadn't have jumped on that train and jumped in that taxi, I believe he would have been alive today." She says she's spoken about for years the exploitation of young stars and the effects it's had on many of them. Do you agree, sort of because this happened so young, it can affect people badly?
But unfortunately, I completely agree. I think the evidence is there in child actors, child stars. Throughout music, it happens all the time. The problem with the music industry is that it's an entertainment industry, so it presents itself in all sorts of ways. But ultimately, it's about making money. It's hardcore capitalism. And if you're doing well, you will be milked for all it's worth. And so the One Direction boys would have been worked and worked and worked in ways that no normal 16-year-old would have been. I remember speaking to Little Mix, and these were little kids, and they weren't expecting it. And suddenly there was like all these flashbulbs and a million questions. And they said from then, for the next year, they sort of whisked from pillar to post without any sort of telling about what was happening to them, no preparation. Things might be a little bit better now, but I don't think they're that much better. I think that, especially in the very hardcore pop world, which is as commercial as it gets, this is a band that sold 70 million albums. That's making a lot of money.
One Direction. Yeah.
One Direction sold 70 million albums. So here are these kids who are unknown. They go on, they become known. They don't become known in the way that people in bands do, where they play in back rooms of pubs. They become known on television, primetime television, what's that going to do to you? You know, so you have someone like Liam Payne, who is, you know, I didn't know him, but he's been promised the world. And then he kind of experiences that for a while in a band with you know, 4 boys who are essentially strangers when they meet. And then that comes to an end. And, you know, what do you do next? You know, what do you do next if I mean, partly I think it's as bad if it does happen for you as it is if it doesn't. And so I don't know if his life would have been any happier if he'd been, you know, hugely successful. I don't think Robbie Williams was, you know. It's far too young. It really is. I don't know what the answer is, because there's a market for this kind of thing. The public loves it, but the damage it does to these young kids, I think, is huge.
But it's not necessarily just a phenomenon of what we saw in the past 20 years when TV talent shows were a thing. This is a tale as old as time, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's so much bigger now. It's, you know, and it might be that we've kind of tipped the edge of the iceberg. I don't know. I mean, now it's moved into things like K-pop, and, you know, it's not so much here, but which I think is just as brutal. And
that's where they really are managed.
Drilled, absolutely drilled. So, you know, what's the answer? I mean, the thing is, all of those kids, it's what they thought they wanted, you know. And I think the saddest thing for someone like Liam Payne is that it's impossible for him to complain, because he's got what everyone thinks they want. He's made money. He's become famous, even if it's not the success that he was hoping for. He's, you know, very famous. To the average person, he's thinking, well, what's the problem? You can't. The psychological weight of that is something that probably only people who've been through the same thing themselves could explain or sympathise with. Now, what do we all need when we're feeling depressed or whatever? You need sympathy, you need empathy, someone who's been through similar things. If you haven't got people who've been through similar things, where do you go? You know, so I could really see, I've got a huge amount of sympathy for what he went through, because I think that it's to get what everybody thinks they want and then find out that you're more depressed than ever, or, you know, lonelier than ever, it must be incredibly hard.
And do you think the music industry realises that now? And if a 14-year-old were to find fame in the way that Liam Payne went on to do now, they'd be handled with a bit more care?
Well, I'd love to say that they would. I mean, the music industry is very, very good about making all the right noises about mental health. But it's an industry above all else. You know, it's about making money above all else. And so, you know, if the next huge star, of which, you know, most of them seem to be coming out of America now. I mean, Olivia Rodrigo, you know, she's in her early 20s, but, you know, she's coming out of teen stardom. Yeah, it's pretty bloody young, isn't it? Is it better in Britain? I don't know. I mean, at the moment, we're not in a stage of the boy band and the manufactured band on television. I can't see it disappearing, though. Not while people are still interested.
What do you think his legacy will be, Liam Payne? I mean, how will he be remembered, do you think?
I think he's be first and foremost remembered for One Direction, which is maybe not the way he'd want to be remembered. But I think, you know, he's going to be remembered for being probably the best singer in the band that was the boy band sensation, that was the sort of television talent show sensation of the 2010s.
Will Hodgkinson, chief rock and pop critic for The Times. Do send this episode along to someone who you think might also find it interesting, and if you want, you can get plenty more from Will over at thetimes.com if you're a subscriber. There is also the very latest news there, as more about the circumstances surrounding Liam Payne's death becomes clear. The producers today were Will Rowe and Edward Drummond. Sound design was by Pranka Deladia. Theme composition was by Maula Seto. And the executive producer is Fiona Leach. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.